Hello and welcome to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Ram Tuli. This podcast is about the joy of guitar. That includes buying guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars. We're talking vintage guitars, new guitars, used guitars, pre-war, flat tops, electric Spanish archtops, custom shop guitars, limited edition guitars, basses, amps, effect pedals, lap steels, mandolins, banjo. If it has strings, we're going to talk about it. I've spent most of my life studying the vintage guitar market. It's truly something I love and I'm passionate about. I can talk guitars all day, and I'm going to. Hey everybody, today I'm talking with Larry Wexer, owner and proprietor of Laurence Wexer Limited in New York City. How you doing, Larry?
I'm pretty good. It's the usual New York craziness, as it is.
Mm-hmm. Today, we're going to talk about pre-war acoustic jazz and mandolins, but everything. We'll talk about anything. But mainly, we're talking about pre-war stuff. There's really two types of vintage guitar collectors. Well, you could correct me. There's guys that focus on acoustic guitars, and then there's guys that focus on electric guitars. Is that how you see it, or do you know mostly a lot of people that buy both, collect both?
I sort of see it that way, but I know a lot of people who cross over, or even though they are primarily electric guys, they want that one or two really cool acoustic guitars.
Okay.
What that may be is depends on their taste.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's, as you know, a lot of the Rolling Stones records were done, or Beatle records, with J160Es and acoustic guitars. Street Fighting Man is not electric guitars on it.
No.
Nope. Most people don't even realize because of how hard driving it is. So there definitely has always been some crossover there.
Do you sell mainly acoustic guitars, or do you sell everything?
I sell everything, but I'm known more for the jazz stuff and the acoustic guitar stuff. But I've had, Sunburst Les Pauls and Blackguard Kellys and Dotneck 335s and all of the above over the years. It's just, it's not my main focus. And when I get good ones, sometimes they just go with the phone call, so it's not obvious that I get all that stuff.
Right. Well, you started off as a collector, and then you started selling?
Yeah, I was in school in Indiana. I mean, I started playing later, and I was good gigging and some in college and playing in a blues band, mostly playing harmonica and singing, actually. When I went to graduate school, I have a master's in ethnomusicology and folklore from Indiana University in Bloomington. And I was really performing a lot there, but I was dabbling and started gathering vintage knowledge by being around that kind of stuff. Bean Blossom, Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Festival was close by, and guys had pre-war acoustics, old banjos, and I was exposed to it and learned about them.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've recorded with some giants. You recorded with...
Well, when I worked in Branson for a while, and I was lucky to meet Roy Lanham at the Pioneers. I did an instrumental thing. I recorded with Roy Lanham and the Sons of the Pioneers, did some cuts for Roy Clark. I worked with the Dillards. I did some gigs with Grandpa Jones. But in Bloomington, I used to sit in with Luther Allison a fair amount. Again, playing harmonica, actually. People know me from different eras as what I do or what I did. I started at Mandolin Brothers in '88 and worked there. I was the sales manager. I was the manager till end of '97, and then went out on my own. So I've got a lot of experience working there, mostly from observing stuff and looking at stuff. I came in with a good amount of knowledge, but it certainly increased being exposed to a real variety of amazing things.
Well, right now, you buy and sell. Is it just online, or do you have a brick and mortar, or?
Somewhere in between. It's sort of a unique thing that I have an office by appointment, and people can certainly make an appointment with me and come and look at whatever I have. It's not strictly online, like, no, you can't come over. I'm happy for people to come over and look at a few different things. Obviously, it requires, I guess, a little more seriousness in that they don't want to feel like, oh, I can just walk into a shop and
mm-hmm.
nose around and leave and kick tires. But people are certainly welcome to come and play guitars. Would
you say most of your inventory right now is acoustic, pre-war acoustic, or?
Yeah, I would say primarily. Variety. I'm supposed to ship out a 3060-18 this week. I sent out a Nick Lucas recently, a 37. I have herringbone and a couple of 1930 OM28s on my list, 57 J200. I have a number of DeQuistos, high-end and some of the rare late ones as far as jazz guitars.
Would you consider yourself more of a jazz guitar player or more of a country player?
In the last, 10 years, I've definitely focused much more on the jazz stuff. I started with Howard Alden, but before that I had taken lessons from Chuck Wayne and Jimmy Rainey and Remo Palmiere.
So it's safe to say that you prefer archtops then, right? Or do you? Maybe not. Maybe you like.
I play hollow bodies. I play plugged in. My feeling on that stuff is that in reality, when you're looking at people gigging, that jazz is conservative electric guitar, or maybe not so conservative anymore. People are always plugged in to play with the rhythm section. It's just where in the continuum. Are they playing with a floating pickup? Are they playing built-in hollow bodies? And there's been a paradigm shift with the younger guys playing Telecasters and semi-hollows. You look at Bill Frisell, Julian Lage, people like that.
Right. So one of the things that this show is really focused on vintage guitars, buying, selling guitars. As everybody knows that I do the vintage guide, the annual guide, and Larry is one of about 3 or 4 guys that I really turn to get my prices for the pre-war guitars, the pre-war flat tops and arch tops, and the really high-end acoustic stuff. And I should give a shout out, George Gruen, of course, and Buzzy Levine, Eric Schlonberg, and Fred Oster, also guys. Schoenberg and Fred Oster. These guys also help me. But you're the guy I bother the most. I don't know why. I guess I always feel like I just call you and you pick up the phone and you'll talk to me. And so when I was doing this podcast, I said, I got to get Larry would be perfect for this one. And Larry, I want to.
Well, I'm happy to do it.
And let's figure. I guess the title of this podcast is going to be, why do guitars made before World War II sound better than guitars made after World War II? Everybody talks about pre-war. Let's get to the bottom of this. Let's figure out what is it. I know it's an easy answer, but maybe it's not an easy answer.
The pre-war thing is a moving target. Things are not static. It's not like there's one monolithic version of a pre-war guitar. That's certainly not the case. Martin, in the 19th century and early 20th century, they were making gut string guitars, even though ostensibly you could order something for steel strings starting in 1922. There was really no structural difference appreciably. Around 1927, things seemed to be it seemed like they can handle steel string, but there's a factory order a couple of months into 1928 where they thickened the top slightly, and that's where the tonal focus of a true steel string guitar with Martin kicks in. But we're talking about 12 fret and smaller guitars. The Dreadnought didn't exist till 31. The OM comes out, 6 examples in 29, but really production 1930. And these all have bar frets and wider necks, and the bar fret and ebony rods, and the bar fret with changes into tang frets with a metal rod in mid 1934, which is a more robust guitar and certainly more of a louder steel string type instrument. But there's a real continuum. These things change. And with Martin's, the desirability, it seems like, or at least the prices, have followed a structural and a size hierarchy. In other words, larger guitars are worth more, and things that are considered within the ideal time period bring more. Like even a 12-fret guitar of a Martin with a belly bridge and pickguard, which is transitional around 2930, are considered more modern and therefore bring a little bit more than the equivalent instrument. Let's say you're looking at 2 0028s, one with a pyramid bridge and no pickguard, and then with a belly bridge and a pickguard. But most of those were discontinued, by 1932, where there were very few 12-fret examples still being made. You have to shift over to 14-fret guitars.
Right.
But the big Dreadnoughts really kick in, 14 fret in 1934, and that's the early ones are quite rare, but they're very desirable. These are the classics. But you're looking at air-dried wood that is stable, and Brazilian rosewoods, even the kind of mahogany. Everything was stable, air-dried, and the craftsmanship was there. These were very handmade. Even what you think of as a factory was a much smaller concern than the modern factory. The Martin Company was not all that big.
Right.
And Gibson started out much more with the archtop stuff, dating from Orville Gibson and the mandolins. But the flat top stuff kicked in the later 20s. And the earliest ones, and around that time period and very early 30s, are very lightly built.
Right. That they used, and I guess they used like ladder bracing, and they used.
There was a transition from the ladder into X brace, and when you look at like a Nick Lucas model, it's very funny because there's so many variations on what a Nick Lucas is, from a peanut body ladder brace to the more LOO type with X bracing and 12 fret and mahogany, and then it goes to 13 fret strap piece, tail piece, and then the last few in 14 fret, mostly in maple, but they did make rosewood and mahogany versions.
So Martin is considered the first American guitar manufacturer, right? The first great American, and he brought that over from Germany.
Correct.
In Europe, I guess in Europe, what were the tops made out of? They didn't use the spruce.
No, there's European spruce.
So were they using spruce in Europe then?
Yeah, but it doesn't really enter into what we think about with these guitars. When he moved from Markneukirchen, Germany, to the United States, and he was in New York at 196 Hudson briefly, and had various partners, and a lot of them. Some of the earlier Martins are really influenced by Spanish guitars that he was aware of, and was finding his way until he started with the X bracing. But the X bracing was still on gut string guitars.
Mm-hmm.
There was an evolution toward the steel strings, which really occurred far after C.F. Martin the first. It was just the level of craftsmanship was always very high from the Martin Company.
So as long as Martin was making guitars in America, did they always use Adirondack spruce?
The pre-war stuff, the transition out of Adirondack, from what I've seen, is generally considered around 1946, pretty much. So when you're looking at, again, structural changes, let's look at dreadnoughts and herringbones and D18s. You have forward X, which is the X is closer to the sound hole, wide neck, large neck block, and that occurs from the inception of 14 fret through mid 1938. There's a transitional time period in 38 through 39, part of 39, where the X is a rear X. It's moved, but it's still the wide neck and no tongue brace and the larger neck block. When they went to the smaller neck in later 39, the neck block size changed, and you have a rear X plus the tongue brace under the fingerboard in the upper bow was added. So,
and that bracing was still scalloped. It was still scalloped bracing?
Yes, scalloping goes through most of 44, practically all of 44. But you have wartime shortages where 43 and 44 go back to ebony rods, but with tang frets, cheaper tuners. The lacquer has a slightly different characteristic because of wartime shortages as well. And then at the end of 44, even with D28s, you still have transitional herringbones in 45 and 46, but the 45s are still Adirondack. 46s are primarily already Sitka spruce tops, but these are non-scalloped tapered brace guitars.
Now, is it true that the herringbone inlay was made in Germany? That's why they couldn't get it after 44?
I'm trying to think. If
that's the old wives' tale. I mean, that's what I read, and I believe I read it somewhere, that they actually were made in Germany. That's why they couldn't get it after 44 or 45. They weren't making it anymore, or they weren't shipping it.
There are a number of things that are imported, like Gibson mandolins, handle tuners, the inlay tuners go into, through 1918. And after that, it was an import issue. And they switch over to straight ivory buttons. So when you're looking at mandolins of that time period, especially like F4s and things like that, it's a clear indication. It's usually I like to look at features more than always specific dates. So with a lot of the Gibson things, things have been revised thanks to Joe Spann and factory order numbers and shipping records, which I don't buy wholesale. I don't think they're 100% correct, but I think they have changed the dating, especially.
I think it shifts it by 2 years, is what I heard.
Yeah, things go later. So like dot neck L5s with hand-carved bracing that we used to think of as 1928 are now we consider 1931. But the desirable features are what's important, not the exact year. You want a dot neck guitar with an L5, which was really the first F-hole guitar, especially in production. The ones that people really want are those. They have specific characteristics.
Right. Now, did Gibson and Martin both get their spruce from the same vendor?
That I'm not sure. I would tend to doubt it.
Like when we talk about where the spruce, the Adirondack spruce, what I read is that lumber supply was depleted in World War II because they built all the gliders out of the spruce. And that's why after 44 or 45, that wood was no longer available. Is that true?
It sounds like a tale.
A tale,
That's
okay.
not something I've heard.
I just remember reading somewhere that all the gliders were made out of that same wood, and that's why there was no more.
That's a lot of gliders.
Yeah. And that's why they shift. I guess they shift right to Sitka spruce right after that, right? 45, 46?
And Gibson shifted to Sitka in a similar time frame. But like pre-war rosewood Gibsons, you see Brazilian up till around 1936. And after that, they're Indian rosewood. Advanced jumbos are Indian rosewood. They're not Brazilian, at least all the production ones. And that's true of any rosewood model, like an SJ or something like that.
Now, as far as the tone woods, mahogany was that considered the bottom tier for both Gibson and Martin?
I think less so with Gibson. I think Gibson always seemed to like mahogany. I think that stems from Martin having the fancier guitars always rosewood, so people looked at it that way. That the more expensive guitars with more trim were always made with rosewood.
As far as I know, the Gibsons didn't make a lot of rosewood backs and bodies, right? Though.
No, you have pre-war J200s, though I've seen there are, I think, one or two maple bodies, which sounded nothing like a post-war maple body SJ200. So, the structure and how they were built were sufficiently different that they were a fairly unique animal.
Was maple the premium wood then for Gibson?
I think they liked it. They used it on archtops and mandolins, so it was something natural for them to use.
Right. Did Orville Gibson invent the archtop guitar?
Well, that's a difficult question because when you're looking at violin construction, I'm sure there was somebody who came up with a similar idea. It was just his thing with the mandolins went into production, and his early instruments, which were very heavy and were carved out of single pieces of wood. The construction type was not really practical from a manufacturing point of view.
Did he started making mandolins before he made guitars, correct?
Yes. Again, with like the inception of the L5 and the Master Model series, which were really like the Lloyd Lord tenure, I don't know that Lloyd really built any of these. He was the signature guy and had some input, but Guy Hart and other people at Gibson really had a lot to do with the Lloyd Loar mandolin family instruments and the L5. But unlike the mandolins, which were almost perfected, they really hit it right from the beginning. The Loar L5s are not as modern or as user friendly as the F5 mandolins and mandolas. The necks are clunkier. They're small frets. They had Versi-tone producers, which were a suspended disc on the inside. They were made with birch backs and maple sides. And so the post-Loar L5s are really more what people desire in today's market. the Eddie Lang and Mother Maybelle era, which we previously had dated as late 20s, but we can still go with that time period into the early 30s, which have a much more modern neck feel, still hand-carved bracing, and a hand-applied finish. Those are a unique instrument in that they really transcend category. They were used, obviously, for Carter family and country music, as well as jazz and rhythm. They really are just an F-hole guitar, and they're a fine instrument.
The style O guitars, you see those around from time to time. Are those well-made guitars? The original, like the 1902, 3, the turn of the century style O's?
Well, that's still, that early is still really Orville Gibson or his designs. The necks are big. They're not suitable for modern playing. They can sound very interesting and cool, and they do have some volume, but they're not perfected modern instruments.
Right. So that, so you get to, as far as mandolin era, why are Martin mandolins not highly coveted?
It's a function of construction. I think George Gruen had said that there's design and there's execution. And even though Martin's very high on the execution, ultimately the design, they used pressed tops. They weren't carved like a Gibson. They just didn't nail that end of that type of construction. Whereas with the flat top guitars, they increasingly, they were really perfected. And you have a whole range. I think you had discussed the 45s with pearl inlay and the fancier guitars versus the herringbone. And I think they used select wood, and they certainly used their best materials for the 45s. And I think they do sound slightly different. They're a little shinier. They're a little different, higher partials. But I don't know that they're clearly superior to a style 28.
Right.
Sometimes a 28 is woodier and has certainly equal volume and projection in comparison if it's the same body size. But they're pretty rare. A D45, they made, 91? But a lot of them were used by professionals and refinished and modified to keep them shiny and looking good on stage. A major collector, I remember a friend of mine had 14 at one time, and only 2 or 3 were original out of all of those. So
your experience, that a lot of the D45s you find have been refinished.
Oh yeah, a large percentage. I find that less true with the smaller instruments for some reason. I've always felt that if something is expensive and smaller, it has a higher survival rate. Maybe you can hide it in the closet more easily and keep it away from the kids.
Yeah.
But
one thing I want to discuss, and a lot of people don't know this. Well, I didn't know this until I started actually collecting Martins, is that the numbering system is, they have a whole numbering system where the higher the number, the smaller the guitar, right? And then the higher the second number, the fancier the guitar. So when you think of the turn of the century, where you get the O18 or the O28.
Right. Most of those guitars are starting, O, double O, triple O, which is equivalent in size more or less to an OM, though there are structural differences. OMs have a longer scale length than their 14-fret guitars, typically. And then Ds, and then yes, like an O17 is all mahogany, an O18 is mahogany with a spruce top, a 28 is a rosewood with a spruce top and herringbone trim in that time period, and a single O42 is top trim, plain headstock, fancy inlays, bound fingerboard. The 45 has pearl on all borders and inlaid headstock and bound. So yes, as the numbers increase on the model end, they are fancier.
Yeah, and sometimes you'll find like the parlor Martins, the 1s and the 2 dash, which are tiny. They're actually like what you played in the parlor. They're small fingers, and
you primarily see that in the 19th century and very early 20th century. I think once you're really going to steel string, you're really seeing O's out and on up.
The one thing that some people don't realize is that the earliest Martins are not the most expensive Martins.
No.
Like somebody, you go on, if you go online, you're trying to look for a Martin, you'll see, oh, here's one. It's a 1902. Why is it only this? And then you find one
It's
1925.
not a steel string instrument.
Right. It's all about the break. And you can't put steel strings on a Martin that was not made for steel strings. Is that not correct?
It's not a good idea. They're really not built for it. They're too lightly constructed, and you're asking for trouble.
Right.
The bracing is lighter, the tops are thinner, the bridge plates are smaller, all of the above. Like I said, there was a real evolution toward handling steel strings. But at a certain point, because of warranty issues, why things changed in the 40s and then after the war, where they're much more heavily built, is to handle that and not come back to the factory with problems.
Right.
As much, because they had lifetime warranties.
Was the OM the first guitar they made that had the 14 frets?
Yes.
So that was the big draw, right?
Yeah, it was supposedly endorsed or initiated by Perry Bechtel of Atlanta. A friend of mine has his D'Angelico, New Yorker cutaway, actually. But I don't know. I think some of the earliest ones were actually not what we see as an OM. I think they had slotted headstocks. They didn't go necessarily with the prototype, which I think they were burned up in a fire in the Atlanta cable company and didn't survive. So hard to really know. But the OMs are a very important guitar. And the first year OM18s are the small production year, but the larger production year for the 28s with the small pickguard banjo tuners. And those are considered the most desirable, though they continued to make the OM through 1933. And they transitioned. The earliest triple O's are basically similar in spec, but maybe slightly more heavily built. Mm-hmm. And they transition into the shorter scale, 24.9 scale triple O in mid-34. And so OMs are fairly rare, and they made 14 OM45 deluxes, about 40 OM45s, and what was it? 765 OM28s, I think. I'm going by memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that for like that. So if you're looking for a great pre-war Martin, where would you, like, somebody said, I want a pre-war Martin? Well, you probably ask them, do you want a Canon, or do you want something that sounds, more? What would you focus? Do you think guys know what they want?
It depends on how somebody plays. Do you play heavy? Do you play with a pick? Are you playing bluegrass? Are you strumming? Or are you finger picker? How big are you? It sounds funny, but in terms of fitting somebody with a guitar, the smaller guitars, even though they, other than certain rare triple O and OMs, bring less than the equivalent dreadnought, but for a lot of people, they're more comfortable and more desirable. And some of the double O's, when you look for a 30s wide neck 0018, they just don't seem to be around. They seem like they were lower production than one might think.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as one thing, when we talked about how we're going to do this, we decided we're not going to give prices, because that kind of puts it into a time frame where this year. But this year was this not a good year for flat tops as far as prices going up?
No, prices went up, but I think the market is increasingly, as market goes up and prices go up, people are increasingly picky. When you're spending a lot of money, do you want something with issues, or are you going to hold out and spend a bit more or a chunk more and get one that's like has no problems? That's really a fine representation of what it's supposed to be. And I've always seen that go on in the market.
Right. This year, I found that especially the Gibson, the high-end flat tops seem to really, like they've been kind of stagnant for a while. This year was a year where they seem to move. And also the sunburst Martins, the ones that have the dark tops, those really flew this year, went up.
Yeah, there's been definitely a heavy push in shade top Martins, is how they were called.
Yeah, shade top.
They didn't call them sunburst.
Do you know the approximate number, like was that 1 out of 100 would have had a shade top?
They were not always noted in the ledgers, though it always, I find amusing, like practically every 1932 OM18 is sunburst. is shaded.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go, oh, rare shaded top, it's like, not really. If it's a 1932 OM18, that's what you expect to see.
This dreadnought that comes like that is rare.
The dreadnought in shaded is rare, and they really bring a premium.
And this year, it seems like I know of quite a few that really went for premiums. People really were.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Having said that, with Gibson, the rise has been inconsistent. I've seen it with 50 stuff. I've seen it with banner stuff, which I think is personally overrated. And whereas J35s have not seemed to go up all that much, 50s, J200s haven't seemed to change all that much. But so different segments of the Gibson flat tops have gone up substantially. J185s went up quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about the J45s and the J50s or the J35s also. When somebody says it's a banner, what do they mean when they say banner?
In the headstock during the 40s, there was a little banner decal saying only Gibson is good enough. Only a Gibson is good enough. So that's what the banner means. It's a script logo over that, a script Gibson, not a block logo, which they went to around 48. And the banner. There's a brief transition like around 46 where you'll see still the script logo, but without the banner.
Mm-hmm.
But they were made in the Gibson factory during the war, and with the Kalamazoo gals, as the book says.
Yep.
A lot of them were not that experienced, and I've seen errors and things that, big necks that are not necessarily comfortable. Like, I know there's a real following for those, but I'm not one of them.
Now, out of the so-called banner years, is the Southern Jumbo the one that people really want or should be looking for?
It's the fancier one.
And I believe that one's rosewood, made out of rosewood.
No, not necessarily. No.
The first year, I guess the rosewood was.
They did make some, and then there are, just like there's some laminate maple banner J45s and things like that. But the normal production model was mahogany. And
I guess Gibson came out with the Southern Jumbo to compete with the dreadnoughts from Martin, correct?
I mean, they were always competing for whatever market. They were the main producers of guitars, those two. I mean, you have the Larson brothers pre-war, but in small numbers. Most of everything was Martin and Gibson, pretty much. But no, that happened much earlier. Gibson came out with the Jumbo,
okay,
which Charlie Monroe and of the Monroe brothers with Charlie and Bill. He played a Jumbo, and those are, I think, the inception of that more dreadnought type round-shouldered Gibson guitar. They have a uniform side depth, and they're really powerful and raw-sounding instruments, and that evolved into a brief transition of what they call the Trojan into the J35,
mm-hmm.
with some slight changes in the side depth tapering and things like that. And the Advanced Jumbo came out in the later 30s, and that was always a rosewood guitar.
So when we think about Gibson and flat tops, I guess the Nick Lucas is always the Gibson, the first one, the notable first Gibson flat top, 26-ish. And how do those compare to a Martin from that same era?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of the Nick Lucas design was a deep guitar, but the earliest ones I don't think quite compete with Martin. I think if you're looking at a 1927 or 28 Martin, which is more of a real steel string instrument, the Martin was a more refined and better instrument, I think. But there was an evolution with those guitars until they got to be X-braced and refined the construction. That's when I think the Nick Lucas are considered more desirable.
And they start off with ladder bracing and then they switch into X bracing?
Yeah, there's a few different incremental structural changes.
So the first Nick Lucas is very close to the L0, L1 that they started making about that same time then?
Pretty much.
Okay. Now, most of us know the L1 because there's a picture of Robert Johnson playing one. Are those hard to find?
They didn't all survive. They were lightly built guitars. They weren't They were not expensive, and they weren't treated all that well. So that's part of why you don't see that stuff very much.
Mm-hmm.
But whether that's actually Robert Johnson's guitar is arguable, or if it may just have been available for the photograph.
Right. That's true. We don't know if that's what he recorded with. But there is the photo. I think there's one or two photographs with him, and he's got that L1. And so we just assume that's what he used. But you're right. It could have been something they handed him for the photograph. So, you know what? Another thing that in 1933, they came out with the LC, the Century. Those are not popular. Why is that? They're beautiful guitars.
Not all of them, but most of them are laminate maple, and the celluloid fingerboards are problematic. If something goes off with them, boy, you want to heat that and have it burn up on you. They're hard to get right.
So then the Super 400 comes out in 35. Does that kind of redefine the flat top era for Gibson?
Well, the Super 400 is an arch top.
Oh, I'm screwed up.
In 1934 with the small upper bout, and again, Gibson continually changed that. That earliest version exists for a couple of years, and then the bout gets larger, the upper bout, and some of the bindings, the F-holes change, etc. There's a period of X bracing before they went back to parallel bracing. So this is part of the pre-war thing of trying to make louder guitars.
Mm-hmm.
Super 4s were the top of the line, expensive.
Maple. They were made out of maple.
Maple back inside spruce top. Most players, I think, generally prefer L5s. They were smaller, easier to deal with, more comfortable.
Do you think how would you compare the sound of a Super 400 with a L5?
L5s are more focused and I think more efficient. When you have to hit something and you're trying to drive that amount of top and that amount of air, a slightly smaller thing is often more efficient. You can drive that top area more easily.
Right.
So the Super 4s, even though they're bigger, are not necessarily louder or more responsive.
Okay. And then the Southern Jumbo, this SJ200 comes out toward the end of the war. How does that compare to the Southern Jumbo itself?
I'm missing you here. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Isn't there the SJ200 that comes out in 46?
Right.
Does that replace the Southern Jumbo?
No. These are entirely different things. Pre-war, there are SJ200s that are rosewood, and the body size is slightly different. And that transitions into the post-war SJ200, which are exclusively maple. With spruce tops and a little more heavily built.
And that's the one people see with the mustache bridge.
Right, the Elvis guitar and things like that. They were, again, a big, fancy rhythm guitar. I think your standard SJ, which is an elaboration of the J45, round shoulder dreadnought, is a more generally useful instrument. It's, again, a little smaller, a little more comfortable, a little more versatile.
One thing, when I started doing the guide, the Vintage Guitar has what was called the 42 Guitar Index. I was familiar with all the guitars in that index, except for one. I never even heard of this. It was the Citation from 1969. Can you tell me something about that Gibson Citation from 1969, and why is it so expensive?
It was just their flagship, super fancy, limited edition archtop. They used very fancy woods. They put a lot of craftsmanship into it, fancier inlays, both back and front of the headstock. It was just an upgraded archtop model. And
people were willing to pay as much for that as they would a Southern Jumbo from the war years?
These are entirely different things. This was an archtop guitar. It's a jazz instrument. There's not a lot of overlap with that, especially. You can find pictures of Joe Pass playing a flat top. I think there's a picture of him with a 0045 somewhere when he was young. But that's not what these guys played.
Mm-hmm. So the Citation, as I gather, they just didn't make a lot of them. They made only a few of these.
No, it's very rare. They reissued them. They did a later version of them, and they bring somewhat less money than the original.
Mm-hmm. I guess they reissued them twice, because I have prices for two variations on that. But I was always surprised. Like, I never heard of this Citation. And then I started, I think I was calling around.
There are things that are very rare, and like Martin, I'm trying to think if it was 38, made 11 0021 S's. These were 14 fret Brazilian rosewood, wide neck, 14 fret guitars. That is cool as hell. With a herringbone backstrip and rosette. Lovely guitar. They made 11.
Mm-hmm.
Go find one. I've had one or two. had, I was aware of several that have gone through my hands. Certain things are that rare, and unless you're really in it or having experienced them, you're unaware of that particular variation. There are things like that.
When it comes to the archtops, how often do you see the old New Yorker D'Angelicos nowadays?
Well, I've been fortunate that I knew Jimmy DeQuisto. I watched him carve. I was at the funeral. I helped Phyllis when he passed away. A lot of that stuff, because they were made in New York, came to me, especially when I was at Manlin Brothers. The big Finn D'Angelico came through. I helped sell it to Scott Chinnery. Things like of that nature, they were just native to here, even though they disseminated throughout the country and elsewhere. So, he made 1,164 guitars total over the years with help, because he had Jimmy DeSerio and Jimmy DeQuisto at various times helping him. The earliest ones are all pretty much him, starting in 1932. But we're talking low production. These are handmade by one guy in Little Italy, New York.
Mm-hmm. And they're
and the New Yorker it didn't come out immediately. It was several years in, and it was his most expensive, top of the line. It was equivalent to the Super 400. So if they were $400 for a Super 400, he was charging $400 for the New Yorker.
Now, as far as the archtops, do the prices really change when they start adding the cutaways? Does a collector want the cutaway, or does the collector want the non-cutaway?
I think a modern player or more of a jazz player generally prefer cutaways. Gibson came out with the Premier, which was in 1939, the L5 Premier, Super 400 Premier. And it took them a year or two to get it right, because the first ones had a shallow neck angle with the fingerboard was flush on the top, and by 40 and 41, they had raised them off the top, the fingerboard extension, and a little further back neck angle, which is more ideal, and you can put a floating pickup on them more efficiently or in the right location. D'Angelico started cutaways in 47.
47.
And there are just a few. And then people are still ordering non-cuts. It depends on style. Still, people want, like dot neck L5s are still very desirable.
Right.
And there are people who would argue that because of the full body, that you're getting more tone and more sound out of a non-cutaway if you're playing exclusively acoustically. That may kick in as a better instrument. It's really a question of how you play and what you use it for.
Who made the best archtop, in your opinion?
Jimmy DeQuisto.
DeQuisto?
No question. I didn't have to think hard about that. Jimmy took it further than anybody. He refined D'Angelico's design immediately. I've had like serial number 2, DeQuisto in my hand. They were immediately more lightly built, more responsive. Jimmy was more consistent, but he did everything himself. And the evolution into the modern archtop that's influenced all the current builders, taking it much further with wood binding, with different type F holes, etc. That's all DeQuisto.
How hard is it to get a DeQuisto right now?
He didn't make that many. He made well over 250 carved guitars.
And they command high prices. It's for sure.
Yeah.
When I see them.
The modernistic ones are even smaller numbers, very often single digits, so they bring considerably more. But in terms of what a jazz player would want, they really want a mature New Yorker XL type instrument. And he made fewer XLs than New Yorkers because a lot of people ordered XL, what you call a New Yorker special, which is a 17-inch New Yorker with a slightly smaller size. So I think he only made around 50 actual XLs. So the difference is just a little bit of binding, primarily in inlay.
There's a guy making art guitars right now. What's it called? The Monteleone?
Oh, John Monteleone, you're right.
So what about those guitars? Those go for big bucks.
John has positioned himself very well, and his stuff was featured in the Metropolitan Museum exhibit along with DeQuisto and D'Angelico. And he's managed to get his prices into 6 figures when people ordering from him, and they're works of art. They're beautiful instruments.
No two are alike?
Not exactly, no. He tends to really
No.
design for somebody.
Now, as far as what did Martin not do correctly with their archtops that makes them that they don't people don't even talk about Martin archtops today?
Same thing as with the mandolins, press tops. The construction of the back and sides was hardly any different than what they were doing for the flat tops. It's not a fully carved instrument. It's just not built and constructed just the same way. The design is not there.
So I was always, people say, oh, I've heard that people convert. they'll take a archtop Martin and convert it to a flat top because I guess the back is if it's right. Is that something that you see a lot?
Yeah, it's slightly different, but that has been done a lot. At a certain point, it's not worth it. A mahogany one to me doesn't make sense. With Brazilian rosewood, it does, but I'd hate to see it done unless the top is compromised. A lot of times you'll have a refinished top where the top's refinished or cracked substantially, and I think that's a better candidate. But because of the neck angles, it's hard to get an exact 14 fret neck joint if you use the original neck.
One thing I wanted to ask too is like when they talk about vintage guitars and new guitars, they talk about hide glue, the horsehide glue.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What is it about that hide glue?
Well, Martin used it at the old factory through 1963. So after that, in the 60s, which is why I personally feel like old factory Martins are one thing, and then the later ones in the later 60s are slightly overvalued in my estimation. But it just dries differently. It's easier to work on. You can melt it and take it out again. And you need to set a neck or repair, it hardens a certain way that enhances transmission of vibrations. So a few of those factors contribute to the desirability of using hide glue.
And then also the rosewood. We always talk about 1969. What happens in 1969 that Gibson, Fender, Martin stop buying Brazilian rosewood? What happens in 1969?
I don't know if it's exclusively exactly right around then, because again, if you look at the mid 60s with the folk music demand, Martin production went up substantially, and due to the Beatles and pop music, the demand for guitars really went up in the 60s, and the availability of the wood was just not there. But to me, a late 60s D28 with a big rosewood bridge plate, even if it's still Brazilian rosewood, is it really that much better than a 1970 Indian rosewood? By that time, there are other things in the construction that, to me, are less desirable and make them not as good. But again, a lot of it was production and demand. Mm-hmm. It's hard to maintain quality when you're having to crank out that much stuff. And that's true across the board. That's true of all these manufacturers. I mean, Gibson seems to have a real track record of coming out with the perfect model and either changing it to where they mess it up or discontinuing it. So they've been really good at that. You look at the J185, they come out with it. The early ones are great. They slightly change it. It's still really good. And then people want them because they didn't make them for very long. And it's a really good guitar. It's a much more versatile instrument than the J200. It's more comfortable. It's smaller. You can finger pick it. And this is, you look at things across the board. Look at 60s arch electrics where they went to skinny necks, where the nut width is so small in the mid 60s. And nowadays, people really don't want that. What they did, some of these are corporate decisions that having nothing to do with.
Do you believe that Indian rosewood doesn't sound as good as Brazilian rosewood? Is that?
I think Brazilian sounds a bit different, but there are a lot of classical builders who have used Indian primarily, and the instruments are phenomenal. They're really great. So a lot has to do, again, with all the other factors of construction and build.
I remember reading somewhere that, because I've always been confused by why 1969, why everybody switches to Indian rosewood. And I remember reading it had something to do with in Brazil, they would no longer sell you the raw wood. They had to cut the wood for you.
They had to mill it, right?
They had to mill it for you. And then I think Martin, everybody just said, well, we're not going to pay to, we need to mill our own because we use every scrap. And I think that was I remember.
That's essentially true.
So it was just really that in Brazil they wanted you to sell you the finished product, not the raw wood itself.
Right, that's part of it. That certainly is. But it comes back to finesse construction. That's why you have all these hand builders starting to show up in that time, after that time period, because there was a decline in quality and people were hoping for something better.
Now, we touched on this early, the bar frets and the second tang frets. Why do they change that fret?
There's a couple of reasons. There are upsides to bar frets. There's more mass, and they really are able to act in a way, or with compression fretting, to maintain the integrity and straightness of the neck because of the mass of metal in the bar fret. That's why a bar fret guitar with an ebony rod will maintain its integrity and stay straight. Whereas, like if I see a 00 Hawaiian guitar converted to tang frets and it still has the ebony rod, it's compromised some structural integrity. But the tang fret is much easier to put in.
Right.
It's just, from a workmanship point of view, it's substantially easier to deal with. I know guys who are very adept at fretting, and they just do not have the understanding or have the experience in dealing with bar frets. It's a whole other thing. It's a very different skill.
Now, just one last thing. I can't thank you enough for your time. I didn't realize I'd take this much of your time. But today, you can buy historical recreations of some of these D28s and the D45s. How do the recreations compare to the actual pre-war guitars? Is it a noticeable difference?
It's just like every kind of created collectible. They're making them in much bigger quantities, not to cast aspersions on Martin, but they're not using, they'll say we're using real pearl, but they're using an extruded pearl product. They're not pieces of pearl on a 45. Mm-hmm. They may be using what they call torrefied, which is artificially dried wood. And I know experienced artisans, people who've worked at the factory, who feel that over dries the wood and makes it very brittle and difficult to work with and prone to cracking. I think they're artificially trying to emulate certain things that cannot really be emulated in that way. And they don't always follow the full specification in replicating these old models correctly. Like one of the elusive things is that time period from 1928 to 31, where like the OM period and the bar fret ebony rod lightly constructed finger picking Martins, which are a unique thing. And without bar frets and without the ebony rod, the response and the structural integrity is different. You have wood that was sitting in these factories and air dried through seasons and acclimated over long periods of time, in addition to quarter sun, back and side wood, whether it be mahogany or rosewood. And it's just, and the lacquer and the thin finishes, it's just not easily a thing they can replicate. They profess to do it. Of course, it's marketing. Mm-hmm. They do that with the Les Pauls. Look at that. It's the endless search for, now we've got it really right, and it's never quite really right. And the wood is just not the same. It's all of those things. So do I buy into it that they're really accurately replicating these things? No, I don't. And not all pre-war Martins are unattainable,
Yeah. If somebody came to you and says, I want a pre-war Martin, what would you sell them? Like, let's say somebody said, I want to buy a pre-war Martin, and what would you, and he had about like $15K. What would you point him to?
Oh boy. See, that's tricky because I would say probably some kind of 00 mahogany guitar. I recently sold a Sunburst 0018H Hawaiian conversion, 12 fret, wide neck. We're in that price range. You can certainly find a 40s 0018 for in that price range and in nice condition. I think those are still attainable and wonderful instruments.
And if somebody came up to you and said, I want to buy a pre-war Gibson archtop, would you point them to the L5?
The L5 is a classic. They were expensive and they did not make them in big quantities. But there are L12s and L10s and L7s that if you have the right bracing and the right time period, they can be very cool and a lot more affordable. So there are alternatives, but you're also looking at the inception of the electric guitar with the ES-150, starting in the prototypes in 1936.
Perfect. I think somebody who's just kind of wants to get their feet wet with something old, acoustic, I think that we gave them enough information, at least where to start.
I think we were pretty detail-oriented. It's very different than a business orientation of, because I think one of the things that I said to you the other day was that there's price and there's value.
Right.
And a lot of these things that are plain, or if they're well constructed, if they're the right thing, they don't have to be the most expensive to be really a great value from a musical point of view and really a fine instrument.
Right. Yep. And they'll always be happy with it. All righty, Larry. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with you later.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. All right.
Take care. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. If you have any questions you want to ask about all the podcasts we're putting up or podcasts you want to hear in the future, send me an email at ram@vintageguitar.com. I'll answer any of your questions. I'll fit these questions in with the shows we're doing. We had a great feedback about shows people want to hear or topics that we discussed, and we're going to try to start addressing those as we go from here. Any message you want to send me, ram@vintageguitar.com. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment on this podcast. Thank you.